couple of weeks ago, I did a poll on Instagram. It was a simple question. Who would you rather punch in the face, Donald Trump or Pedro Sánchez? I was expecting Trump to win by a large margin, but in the end, contrary to my expectations, it was very close. I guess a lot of Spanish people hate Pedro Sánchez. My reason for the poll was that Sánchez was having his 15 minutes of international fame after a public spat with Donald Trump. The issue was the use of U.S. bases in Spain for the attacks on Iran. Spain's No a la Guerra was among the top stories for a few days, and from what I hear, the whole thing gained Sánchez some fans in the U.S. I don't have much to say about the larger context of the Iran war and geopolitics in the Strait of Hormuz, but I can say something about Pedro Sánchez, because I hate the guy too. In fact, I've been hating Pedro Sánchez for so long I could barely remember why. So let's do a little refresher on the last several years of Spanish politics. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 134. It's all about Pedro Sánchez. We've got more Pedro Sánchez and less Donald Trump in this one, but I have to mention the recent disagreement between the two. Shout out today to Karen. Karen says, I've been listening a lot and continue to appreciate your informative, entertaining, and nuanced writing and your strong voice. Wishing you all the best. P.S. My family of 3 is officially moving to Barcelona in April. Thank you very much, Karen. Karen has actually donated before. She is a multi-donor because she donated and sent me a very nice comment a few months ago. So this is the second time that Karen is supporting the podcast. She sent me a follow-up asking me about the history of Spanish-American relations and about the current pissing match between Pedro Sánchez and Donald Trump. Pissing match is her expression. I was hoping to avoid the topic of Pedro Sánchez and his disagreement with Donald Trump, basically because I figured it was a news cycle thing that would be forgotten in a few days. Following every current thing in the news, especially everything that some politician says, is a thankless job, and I don't want it. But Karen made a donation, and that inspired me to write the article. So, if you would like to support the podcast, head over to expatmadrid.com/donate. You can donate anything from 10 euros on up to however much you want. expatmadrid.com/donate. If you donate some money, I will give you a shout out, and if you attach a question to your donation, it is very likely to be answered because, hey, I am happy to serve my donors in any way I can. So thank you, Karen. expatmadrid.com/donate is the donation page if you would like to receive a shout out on the next episode. Let's get back to our recap of the last several years of Spanish politics, starting with Sánchez's vote of no confidence. Pedro Sánchez came to power in 2018 after staging a vote of no confidence against then-President Mariano Rajoy. This was after a few judicial sentences came down from Caso Gürtel, a corruption case which had been dragging on for years and which implicated important members of Rajoy's party. Right-wingers spent the next few years calling the PSOE, the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, los golpistas, as if this were a coup d'etat and completely illegitimate. That is a big exaggeration. Parliamentary procedure was followed. No confidence votes are risky, and this one happened to work out for Sánchez. But the fact is, he made it into office without being elected president of the government. Quick side note, here in Spain, the title President of the Government basically refers to a prime minister. I usually use the term president because officially he's not prime minister, but we shouldn't understand president in the sense of an executive branch presidency like the US has. And another quick side note, when I write about politics, I am writing as a man on the street. I am a hardworking Spanish American trying to get by and maintain some personal dignity in a complicated world. So if you're listening to this and you are thinking that I don't seem to be repeating the typical partisan slogans or pretending to be an expert on fiscal policy, you're right. I'm just some guy with an opinion and a podcast. Anyway, the newly unelected president was able to govern by coalition with the far left and some of the separatist and regional parties, notably the Catalan independence parties. Which brings us to our next topic here, Pedro Sánchez cozying up to the Catalan independence parties. That, when I review the history, is the original reason I despise Pedro Sánchez. Back in 2017 and 2018, if I had been able to vote, I would have been a single-issue voter. And the issue would have been the unity of Spain. The Constitution is clear on this. Article 2 mentions la indisoluble unidad de la nación española, patria común y indivisible de todos los españoles. What that amounts to is basically that Spain is one country, unified and indivisible, a homeland for all Spaniards. It must be said that I wasn't a Spaniard myself at the time. I was an American living in Madrid, and I formed my opinions on the indivisible unity of Spain down there. Soon after the unconstitutional and illegal Catalan independence referendum, I found myself living in Barcelona. At first, I thought that living among the Catalans might make me more sympathetic to their cause. It didn't. In fact, over 7 or almost 8 years of life in Catalonia, nobody has made any attempt to charm me, and nobody has given me a good explanation as to why I should change my mind about Spanish unity. But I don't want to write a whole article about Catalan independence. I just value constitutional order, and I didn't like the fact that Sanchez's first act in office was to form a coalition with the very people who had just tried to subvert the Constitution. Later, after losing some of his seats in Parliament in the 2023 election, Sanchez further placated the Catalans with a law declaring amnesty for anything independence or referendum related. Several leaders of the independence movement were pardoned and let out of prison. Fearless Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont is still hiding out up in Belgium. I guess his crimes aren't pardonable. Let's talk about moving Franco's tomb. Because getting back to Pedro Sánchez, one of the first things the government did when in office was to move Franco out of Valle de los Caídos. Old-timey right-wingers didn't like this much. In case you're not up to speed, Francisco Franco won the Civil War in 1939 and soon after started building himself a large basilica outside Madrid. I wrote the whole story of Francisco Franco and the Civil War a few months ago, and I still have not recorded it for the podcast, so I owe that to all of you. I apologize. I will get to it. Anyway, soon after the 1939 Civil War victory, Franco started building his tomb outside Madrid. Famously, he used the labor of prisoners of war to do this, so Valle de los Caídos is kind of a monument that a lot of people despise, for reasons apart from the fact that Franco was buried there. Because eventually he was buried there after his death in 1975. The plaza outside the basilica is modeled on St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, and the whole thing is topped by a 150-meter-high cross, meaning you can see it from a long way off if you're in the mountains north of Madrid. Foreign journalists are apparently required by international law to refer to the whole thing as pharaonic, a reference to the Egyptian pharaohs entombed in their pyramids. The historical memory laws had for some time been allowing people to dig up Civil War-era mass graves, and a lot of old fascist monuments had been removed too. Street names changed and things like that. This has been happening the whole time that I've been in Spain. just a bit over 20 years now, possibly for a little bit longer. The story is that after the dictatorship ended, people decided that it would be better to just forget about the whole thing and move forward. That lasted for a few decades, but now we're talking about it more openly. Moving Franco's tomb was yet another attempt to change the view of history, and I don't have much of a personal opinion about it. They moved Franco to the cemetery at Mingo Rubio, just outside El Pardo. That's a lot closer to Madrid, and I don't think it was the government's intention. But the Franco family also had their say in the whole thing, and one of the offers on the table was to put him in the crypt at the Almudena Cathedral, which hardly would have been better. After that, we have Pedro Sanchez's unconstitutional COVID lockdowns. I had very little respect for Pedro Sánchez going into the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020, and I lost that respect when he declared the state of alarm. Believe it or not, I don't own a TV. I read the news online, and up to that point, I had never seen Sánchez speak. But it seemed like a historical moment, so I watched his speech on my laptop. He said something about how true bravery consisted in washing your hands and staying at home. I wanted to puke. He seemed like a wimp and totally out of his depth. I was hoping for strong leadership I could trust, and Pedro Sánchez wasn't it. Anyway, we weren't allowed to go outside for months. There was a pretty clear social class distinction in how much people approved of this, because of course, office workers loved it. They could sit at home in their pajamas, occasionally hop on a meeting, get everything delivered to their door by immigrants, and basically just take it as a 2-year vacation. I hated the whole thing because everything I wanted to do was illegal, and this went on for a shockingly long time. Eventually, the courts declared the lockdowns to be an unconstitutional violation of basic rights, specifically the constitutional right to freedom of movement. In theory, some of the people who were fined for walking around the block were able to get their money back on appeal, but I would assume I'm not the only person who lost a lot of trust in the Spanish government as a result of the mismanagement of the COVID-19 situation. But I don't want to talk about that too much either. Our next thing is the Spanish government's kowtowing to the European Union. This is a larger problem, and it goes beyond Pedro Sánchez. But it seems like European governments are, at this point, forced to defer to the European Union on a whole lot of things. It's not really clear who's in charge, if anyone. Here's a small example. Daylight saving time. I detest daylight saving time. I hate it with every fiber of my being. And apparently so do a lot of other people. Pedro Sánchez has said he wants to get rid of it, but oops, he can't, because he needs a consensus from every country in the EU to do so. I have a whole article about the daylight saving debacle. It's episode 104 of the podcast. You can check that out if you would like. Suffice it to say that the whole thing is pretty stupid, but there's nothing to be done. We're changing the clocks in a couple of weeks, and despite repeated government promises to the contrary, there's no end in sight, because Sánchez can't do anything without a 27-country consensus. Another example is more serious. I recently read that Barcelona's government has suggested they'd like to stop foreign hedge funds from buying up flats. This would help with the housing crisis, but oops, turns out we can't do it, because one of the fundamental freedoms of the EU is free movement of capital. Apparently that means that Dutch companies can trade our national real estate like Pokemon cards, and there's nothing we lowly Spaniards can do about it. Generally, these topics are part of a larger topic of the EU's bureaucratic inefficiency. When the British voted for Brexit back in 2016, I was very critical of their decision, like a lot of other people. But 10 years later, I also have the feeling that I'm being taxed into oblivion by a government that doesn't represent my interests. A government which instead defers on many questions to a bunch of Brussels bureaucrats. It's possible that I'm wrong and that the EU does all sorts of brilliant things for everyone, But in that case, they're not doing a very good job of keeping us informed about what exactly those brilliant things are. As it is, I feel like Sanchez and his cronies are delighted to pass off blame for certain problems to the EU, which bogs us all down in even more bureaucracy, while nothing gets done. I've written about this before. European efficiency suffers, and it's hard for businesses or countries to compete when they have to deal with 7 layers of bureaucracy before trying anything new. All of which brings us to our next point. Sanchez and the Socialists hate business. These days I have a small online business. Trying to run such a thing under a socialist government is not much fun. The tax people are always up my ass about one thing or another. Apparently, their inspectors get paid just for opening investigations into people like me. They're incentivized to harass small business. Also, they've raised my Social Security payments quite a bit the last few years. I've even had to pay for a retroactive rate hike years after the fact. We could debate the definition of socialism. This certainly isn't what Karl Marx had in mind. But what I mean in Spain's case is basically that taxes are high and there's a large government and welfare state. The Socialist Party who run things don't talk much about small businesses and the need to support them. They're more into inventing new government subsidies and raising taxes and creating dependence on the state. On the other hand, they've redefined the different types of work contracts so that seasonal work counts as indefinite. People can go on unemployment benefits for months every year and still be counted as employed. I'm not the first person who's pointing out that this sounds like an attempt to fake the unemployment numbers so they can claim they're improving the economy. And then there are the laws that make it hard and expensive to fire people, which sounds great from a workers' rights perspective. The unintended consequence, though, is that some people just want to sue the company for a larger severance package rather than do their jobs. Why should you work if you can't be fired for not working? That sort of thing comes up a lot with my wife Morena, who manages a team at a large company here in Barcelona. I wrote about it at length in my article on working in Spain. Let me see if I can find that one. Ooh, that is way back at episode 14. Check that out if you would like. Episode 14, Working in Spain. But let's move on to the housing and cost of living crisis. I have a whole article about the Spanish housing crisis, and it is a big topic. Not to send you every 20 seconds to another episode of the podcast, but that is episode 109, Spain's housing crisis. Suffice it to say that the government tried their best to solve it, and they only made things worse. The new housing law passed in 2023 has created a huge drop in the number of flats for rent. Less supply plus more demand, largely due to mass migration, makes a terrible system that just exploits people who need a place to sleep. Meanwhile, it takes years to get all the permits to build anything new. It's a shit show. Also, it's obvious to everyone that prices are double what they were when Sanchez took office. I'm talking about the prices of going to the grocery store, for example. The prices of food and the prices of everything have doubled or more, and most people's salaries have not doubled to compensate. When Socialist Party fanboys and their coalition partners further to the left complain about the rise of the far right, I always want to point out that if the leftists were able to make society work better for regular people, the far right wouldn't be rising. But it is rising, and that tells you something. Recently, Spain's macroeconomic data have been impressing journalists at The Economist, who say we're doing just fine. But that doesn't seem to translate into real improvements for man-on-the-street types like myself. Another important reason why a lot of people hate Pedro Sánchez has to do with the sex and corruption scandals in his government. Sanchez's government loves to wrap themselves in the purple flag of international feminism. In practice, there's been a recent wave of PSOE party members resigning due to allegations of sexual misconduct. Nothing directly touching Sanchez, but it is his party and his most ardent supporters. The last couple of years have also been clouded by accusations of corruption. I have 2 articles here about Caso Coldo. It's a long story and it's still going through the courts. The articles are episodes 67 and 89 of the podcast, if you would like to check those out. The short version of the story is that some of Sanchez's best friends were allegedly selling surgical masks to the government during the pandemic and pocketing the proceeds. This was done through anonymous shell companies, exactly how you'd do it if you had nothing to hide. The case, like I said, is going slowly through the courts, just like Gürtel back in the day. There's actually a cameo in episode 89 from Delcy Rodriguez, who is now president of Venezuela. She was tangentially involved in some of the PSOE's shady dealings a few years ago. I'm glad to see she's doing well. Also in semi-related news, José Luis Ábalos, Sanchez's right-hand man for years, was renting luxury flats for escorts and then getting those escorts jobs in public companies. He would then text his homies comparing the services received from various girls he had hired online. That's in my article and podcast episode about sex scandals. My God, have I got a lot of content here. That is episode 101, Spanish Sex Scandals, if you would like to hear more about that. There's nothing erotic about it. This guy looks like an overgrown toad. But there's nothing illegal about hiring prostitutes here in Spain. Still, it doesn't come across as very feminist when all your closest friends are puteros or are resigning for sexual misconduct allegations. I should also add here that one of the government's promises on coming to power was that they would prohibit prostitution, but they haven't done it. Thankfully, though, men can now identify as women on their national ID cards. Feminism. All this brings us back to Pedro Sánchez and the war in Iran. People who have not been following Spanish politics for very long don't know this, but Pedro Sánchez's No a la guerra was a callback to 2004 when Spain pulled out of the Iraq War. If you didn't know that Spain was involved in Iraq to begin with, I don't blame you. But then President José María Aznar wanted to cuddle up to the US and Great Britain and sent out 1,300 Spanish troops to join in a very unpopular conflict. They didn't see much combat and didn't stay long. On March 11th, 2004, radical Islamists blew up 4 trains in and around Madrid's Atocha station. 193 people were killed, making it by far the deadliest terror attack in Spanish history. This was just 3 days before a national election. Long story short, the Socialist Party won that election and pulled Spain out of Iraq. No a la guerra was the popular thing for a couple of years around that time. Pedro Sánchez could be gone from the Spanish government soon, but he's still a youngish guy. It seems like his very public spats with Donald Trump and with Israel, etc., might just be attempts to rebrand himself as an international leftist symbol. Maybe his retirement plan is to become a sort of smarmy, polo-shirted Che Guevara for Gen Z to make TikTok dances about. In the meantime, he doesn't want the US using their bases in Spain for refueling planes on the way to Iran. He also doesn't want to invest 5% of the GDP on defense, as agreed to by other NATO countries last year in 2025. The whole European Union, but Sánchez in particular, seem content to sit on the sidelines, wringing their hands while other people do geopolitics. From the man who once said that true heroism consists of washing your hands and staying at home, I would expect nothing more. I am voting in the next Spanish election because the other day I got a letter from the electoral census saying that I am officially registered to vote in Spain. Now that I am finally a citizen, I get to go to the polls and choose our new government. Pedro Sánchez has repeatedly said he's going to ride out his current mandate, no matter how unpopular he gets. In that case, the next national election would be in the summer of 2027. But in the parliamentary system we have, he could call elections earlier if he had to. Or the opposition could hold a vote of no confidence, just like Sanchez did back in 2018. Either way, I'm not really looking forward to voting, because I don't like any of the political parties in Spain. And we have several. For years, the PSOE and the PP dominated Spanish politics, but during the economic crisis, there was a splintering. New parties were created left, right, and center. The leftist ones split and then split again. The far right rose and fell and now seems to be rising once more. Over here in my working class neighborhood in Barcelona, I don't really support any of these ideologies. In fact, the government and media establishment has done quite a bit over the last 10 plus years to lose my trust. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. Finally, today let's talk about Pedro Sánchez and the future of Spanish politics. Like I said, Pedro Sánchez has been unpopular from the beginning and has been getting more unpopular as time goes by. There are still some ride-or-die socialists who will vote for the PSOE no matter what. But as my poll at the beginning of this article suggests, Pedro Sánchez is very unpopular among large swaths of the Spanish population. It's broadly assumed that Sánchez and/or his party will be voted out of office in the 2027 election, and that the next government will be a coalition of the PP and Vox. I'm a little bit bothered by saying PP as the name of a political party. That is the Partido Popular, the PP, we could say. It sounds a little bit better in Spanish. Either way, a lot can happen in the next year or so to upend our current assumptions. Sanchez's 15 minutes of fame seem to be over already, and I actually resisted writing this article for about a week because I didn't think any of this would amount to anything. In fact, I didn't want to spend my time on that empty suit Pedro Sánchez at all. But here we are talking about him whether I want to or not. There's a quote I like from the naturalist John Muir. It goes, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." That's how I often feel about reading the headlines these days, because today's relevant quote, "No a la guerra" in this case, turns out to be connected to the Iraq War and the Atocha bombings more than 20 years ago. And those U.S. military bases in the south of Spain are connected to Franco, whose story goes back to the Spanish-American War of 1898. And if you pull that thread, you end up back at the Reconquista and the Muslim conquest, maybe all the way back in Rome. That's about all I've got for today. Thank you once again to Karen for supporting this podcast. You can go to expatmadrid.com/donate to donate to the cause here, expatmadrid.com/donate. I appreciate any amount you can send my way, and you can attach a question to your donation, and there's a very high probability that I will take the time to answer it. Like I said, I didn't really want to talk about Donald Trump and Pedro Sánchez today, but I ended up doing so anyway because I respect the donors and I would like to help in any way I can. Karen's actual question was about the entire history of U.S.-Spanish relations. That is a much longer story. I think I have something about that in a previous episode. Actually, it's episode 111 called Anti-American Sentiment in Spain. Episode 111 if you would like to check that out. That's just a very brief introduction though. I have kind of in the longer pipeline of things I'm thinking about, a bit more about Spanish-American relations because of course there is a war between the two countries in 1898. I'm guessing that my second half of the article about Franco will have more about the US because to some extent the US was supporting or at least tolerating Franco for the duration of his regime. Spanish people don't like this at all, but the fact is that Franco had a history of fighting against communism, and that seemed pretty important during the Cold War, so the US was at least willing to work with him in order to have a European country that was strongly anti-communist on their side. All this to say, check out episode 111 for more on the relationship between Spain and the US, and also subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening, and you will receive notifications when I have future episodes about this topic and others that you might enjoy. You can head on over to YouTube and check out my channel there, Learn Spanish with Daniel. You might be listening to the podcast on the Learn Spanish with Daniel channel, but if not, head on over there and learn some Spanish. I have lessons about grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, Spanish slang I'm enjoying doing a lot of these days. Quite a bit of content to help you with your Spanish. So just head over to YouTube and put Learn Spanish with Daniel into the search box. You will find me. Not much else to say today. Let me point you once again in the direction of my donations page, expatmadrid.com/donate. Thank you very much for listening and for your donations. We will talk soon. From the beautiful city of Barcelona, hasta la próxima.